Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this, the 13th meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee for 2013. Could I start by asking everyone to switch off any mobile devices that you have so that we don't get any disturbances, and go straight to agenda item 1, which is the draft budget scrutiny. We're taking round table evidence on the Scottish Government's draft budget 2014-15 and focusing on the council tax reduction. And I'd like to welcome today's witnesses, who are Ruchir Shah, a Policy Manager from SCVO, Peter Kenway, Director of the New Policy Institute, Susan Mathers, Deputy Chief Finance Officer, Revenues and Benefits of Falkirk Council, Jackie Coppell, I hope I said that right, that's okay, the Council Tax and Benefits Manager, Dundee City Council, Paul Drury, Director of Income Generation and Development with Bethany Christian Trust, Sarah Flavel, did I say that right? Flavel, sorry. Director and Chair and Benefits Advisor, Gordon Rural Action. Peter Kelly, Director of the Poverty Alliance. Les Robertson, Institute of Revenues, Rating and Valuation and Service Manager of Revenues at Fife Council. This is a round table discussion. I hope people feel relaxed about making points, asking questions. You don't have to answer to our witnesses. You don't have to answer every question that's raised. If you think you have something you would like to contribute, then just indicate and I'll let you come in. But we'll try and keep it as fluid as we possibly can and try and draw out as much information from you all as we can. I think it's possibly to get the ball rolling. I'll ask a general question and see who we might be able to get a response from. In our earlier discussion, we were looking at the transparency of the information that's in the budget, and while all the figures that we have seem to be able to be compiled, they're not particularly clear. That you have to look through sets of data to try and calculate everything and come to the figures that are contained within the budget documents. Can I ask, in general terms, are people content with the way that the information is presented? Do you understand where the budget lines lead to, and from your own perspective, is it helpful the way that the information is put down in the budget documents? Don't want to target anyone in particular, but get the ball rolling. Ruchir, you.
Okay, thank you.
So you're closest to me.
All right, okay. Well, okay, I'm quite happy to make general points, because I guess some of the issues can be quite technical, but that's probably where we've, as the umbrella body for third sector, can come in. I think a number of years ago we suggested that the budget should probably be a co-produced effort, rather than something which government comes up with and then puts out in a very short timescale for review. It should be something where we all have an opportunity to see some of the kind of issues, some of the kind of challenges that government is trying to balance, and have an opportunity not just within Holyrood, but also wider civil society, business community, and others as well. And that way, we can all bring our collective knowledge, clout, and input into the budget setting process. So, and that, of course, would require a very transparent approach to the budget, where things are much clearer, it's analysed in much more depth, and some general points can be communicated much more easily. So that's one way I think that we could do that. Now, in terms of the budget as we have it right now, when we've looked through it, we've obviously seen the breakdowns of the budget up to level 3, which is obviously the civil servants term for which is quite for a level which still is quite high level in terms of the budget. The problem we have is that the budget itself is very the kind of allocations that we're looking at are very large blocks. And it's very difficult to kind of see how we can do much when you have to dedicate so many billions to the NHS, so many billions to local authorities. And there's a few million here, you can move around, a few million there, you can move around. But the actual real action actually comes within those blocks, and how the money is spent within those blocks. And that is not always very transparent from the budget statements and the budget information that's made public.
One specific example that was given to us, the child poverty strategy. Although the draft budget cites support of the strategy, there's not a clear link to the funding. Peter, is that your experience? Can you track where the money is identified and where it's intended to go?
I think that's been a problem for a number of years. The commitments that are made within things like the child poverty strategy, then following those through and finding out where the money goes, and not only where the money goes and what it's spent on, but what the impact is. That's proven to be something of a challenge. So yeah, I think when we see, much as Ruchir has just said, you know, when we see these big blocks of money being spent, it's then where, you know, what's the finer detail, and sometimes we often don't see that.
Just want to ask a question on that, or ask another question of, does anyone want to make a comment in general terms about the budget from their perspective, where the information lies, or something that they were looking for which is not quite as clear, that we could maybe get some clarification around if you were to ask any questions about it? No? No. Clearly. In that case, another specific would be support for advice. The government's budget line 2.5 available to Citizens Advice Scotland and 5.1 for Making Advice Work initiative. The figure for this initiative is referred to in the budget, but there are different figures contained in the budget around a difference of 2.35 million, which comes from Money Advice UK. So in tracking that money, does that confuse, or does it allow people to understand where the money's coming from? Sarah, I think you might have a...
I think, you know, I can only speak from our case in Aberdeenshire. It's difficult because we aren't part of Citizens Advice Scotland, and we're the largest provider of advice and information in Aberdeenshire. So Citizens Advice is not that, and Aberdeenshire Council is our largest funder. And currently, at the moment, they're only telling us about our funding in 6 months at a time, because they're undergoing a massive review of what they spend on advice and information in Aberdeenshire, and it's taking a lot longer. So we don't really know how much money is there, whether there's going to be more or less, although they keep telling us there's going to be more, and it is quite difficult to find out from the council at the moment. We had a meeting with them last week, and I'm sure it's because they don't know themselves, but they can't tell us how much we're going to have in 6 months' time, whether we can continue to even, you know, carry on providing the service. We provide all the money advice in Aberdeenshire. Citizens Advice doesn't provide any. And it's separately funded. And I don't really have anything to do with the money advice other than kind of, so I can't really comment on that.
Our local authorities, I know, Les, you've got two hats on here today, but maybe from a council perspective, is that an issue that you identify?
Certainly from not my current role, but in my previous role, funding for CAB, etc., was very problematic insofar as local authority budgets are being cut quite considerably, and Fife Council, we're looking at roughly about a £100 million cut over the next 4 years. It's very difficult to give for it in Fife, like it's C8, CARF, Citizens Advice and Rights Fife, guarantees of what funding they can get long term from the council. And I know in Clackmannanshire we were looking at 12% cuts for advice agencies. Now, obviously, that doesn't take where I don't know where the advice agencies. I know they can draw money down from like Money Advice Scotland, etc. But certainly, councils are the biggest provider of funding, and if council budgets are getting cut, I think councils tend to pass that on wherever. They try not to pass it on, but if you're looking at such scale of cuts, maybe if Fife Council has about an £800 million budget, taking £100 million out of that is quite a significant amount of money. And obviously, the third sector, basically, if we're funding them, they share the cuts. I know what Fife Council and same Clackmannanshire are doing now is we actually publish all our budget savings proposals, and they are discussed with the Chief Executive of CARF, saying, look, this is what we can do, and we do try to follow a 3-year budget process, but yes, money's going to be tighter, and there are going to be cuts.
However, under the review of all the councils, Aberdeenshire apparently came out as very underfunded for advice compared to, say, Fife and Clackmannanshire. So they had undertaken to increase the funding next year. But they're still just sort of doing it 6 months at a time while they figure out how they're going to fund that. And obviously Scottish Legal Aid gives us quite a lot of funding as well, and that is not going to change as far as I know.
In Falkirk Council, there's been increased investment in the advice services, and they've been drawing down on, although last year we were in a similar position to Fife and Kilmannon, and we were reviewing the third sector funding, we've been using big lottery support funding and various other initiatives to expand advice services, given the impacts of welfare reform. So we've been looking at other sources to augment, but in the past, passing on cuts similar to the third sector, similar to Fife and Kilmannon.
Kevin, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, yes, and I would like to move back to council tax reduction and refer to the paper, the written submission that we have from Dr Kenway, which gives us some comparisons with what's going on south of the border. And in that paper, I think one of the statements which we're all aware of to quite a huge degree is the statement, the most important aspect of the localisation of council tax changes in England is not the local design of the schemes, but the localisation of the financial risk away from the UK Treasury. I wonder if Dr Kenway could maybe expand on that and maybe compare and contrast the difference between the national scheme that we have put in place here by the Scottish Government in collaboration with COSLA compared to the schemes that are currently on the go in south of the border.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you to the committee for the invitation. Since rather regrettably, I do think this actually is a hugely important subject, and it may even be that localisation is the part of welfare reform south of the border that is actually the revolution rather than universal credit. So I think, although there's always a danger of going of over-emphasising the importance of what one knows about, I think you're absolutely right. I'm in many ways delighted to find that is of the words written here, the words you pick out on. The key difference, of course, is that there is no English government, as it were, that can interpose itself between the UK and the 326 English local authorities who have had to design their own schemes. And it is, I think, perhaps if it's this combination of this shifting of the risk, which in a sense is now achieved, of course, by previously up until April this year. Although, of course, local authorities administered council tax benefit, in the end, as long as you got your paperwork right, the Treasury picked up the bill. So in some sense, if there was if a factory closure or people lost their jobs or indeed went on to shorter hours and became entitled to some council tax benefit or more council tax benefit, that bill was absorbed centrally, in the end on the shoulders of taxpayers at large. And as a matter of principle, it seems to me that the idea that shocks, in some sense economic shocks, factory closure, should be absorbed generally, as widely as possible, is the right principle. The factory closure absorbed generally isn't really a burden for society as a whole. What we've now got in England is this situation where there's the 10% cut in grant, of course, which is bad enough, but if there's an increased demand for council tax benefit, an increased entitlement to it, that will be borne locally. Now, of course, the story is sold. If you can get people off council tax benefit, if there's a strong economic recovery, then you, O Council, will keep the money. We'll see. But there's no doubt that if there's an impact, that will be borne locally. And this creates, I think, a conflict, a financial conflict of interest. Local authorities and local taxpayers, under this arrangement, now have an interest in having fewer rather than more council tax benefit recipients from a purely financial point of view. One sign of this we notice in a very small number of English schemes that they've introduced a residency requirement. You have to live in your area for 5 years, I think it is, in a couple of cases, before you're entitled. Those are areas that perhaps have high levels of bed and breakfast or high levels of perhaps people moving in. They are trying to protect their budget. And this seems to us to be a very... Maybe nothing will come of it. Maybe in the end it's just a small effect. But the potential now is there for local authorities to want to keep out and get rid of people who need council tax benefit because of the burden it imposes on their budget. Now, maybe nothing will come of that. One never can tell in advance whether a development is going to be a big one or a small one, but the potential is there for a race to the bottom. And local authorities, however much they may wish to support local, very low-income households with their council tax, will find themselves under pressure to help less and less. And that seems to us to be a potentially very dangerous situation that really threatens almost in some sense the kind of the unity of the country. Scotland has avoided that, and so, as I understand it accidentally in the first instance, so did Wales, by having a national scheme. And it seems to me that then at least burdens are borne at the Scottish level, and also the pressure towards a race to the bottom, local authorities having to compete against one another, their neighbours, to avoid having too many recipients, that is avoided. So it does seem to me that whatever one does, one should have a scheme at the highest possible level, which in the current circumstances here, of course, means at the Scotland level.
Can I come back, Convener? Because we've talked a lot on this committee about cost shunting from Westminster with the welfare reform cuts onto other bodies such as the Scottish Government here who've picked up the tab and local authorities right across the country. What you're describing to me seems even worse south of the border, because you're really describing what may lead to some kind of ghettoisation with folks who require council tax benefits in the past being forced out of certain local authority areas, and a situation where folks will only become eligible if they've stayed in authorities for a certain amount of time, which again seems daft, because if people are going to move to try and get work, for example, that becomes even less likely if they cannot pick up the benefits in the place that they move to. Would that be right in saying that's what you've...
Yeah, you are right in saying that. I mean, the point I would stress is that a lot of these developments, like for example the residency requirement, are at the moment very isolated examples. I mustn't overplay it. The other point I would add, though, you make absolutely the right point about people moving for work. I think you mustn't look for too much logic in what's going on here. There are huge contradictions in what is going on, and that I think makes it particularly difficult to get to grips with. But the path is a potentially very troubling one indeed.
Can I just get a bit of clarification from you, Dr. Kenway? As I understand it, the scheme in Wales was funded entirely from the Welsh Government. Therefore, there was no local authority input into the funding programme. 17 million of the shortfall in Scotland came from local authorities. So is there a danger of, clearly not the same scale of problem as they have in England, but if local authorities have to find a share of the £17 million, does that not leave them open to having this conflict between council areas where they have the same problem in England?
I think it's about... It depends, is the answer. I think what matters is what happens if your numbers start going up and down. If in some sense there's a pot, who's putting into that pot? That's, as you say, 70 million put in. That's a slightly different question. In some sense, it's who's bearing the risk. Who's bearing the risk at the margin, who's bearing the risk at the edge, I think is what's important here. And that's the distinctive thing about England.
Jamie wants to come in on that.
Can I also just ask, Doug, I'm sure also what else is important that in Scotland is a national scheme, so that imperative for local authorities try and shuffle things around. You know, they don't have that leeway, and presumably, as you said earlier, the race to the bottom can't really happen in the same sense as is happening south of the bottom, because it is a national scheme.
I think if it's I think a national scheme is the single. There's points of detail for sure, but I think that the national scheme is the best guarantee of avoiding those kind of those sort of worst effects that we see potentially in England.
Just on the level of detail, just to make it clear that we do have the same, local authorities have the same risk as would our colleagues down south. All the financial risk for a local authority, for example, if you had like Halls of Broxburn closing down, if that was done now under the new scheme, the increase in caseload would be borne by the local authority and that local authority only. Whilst the local authorities will fund the scheme, all the financial risk is still back on the local authorities, as are the financial benefits. And it's maybe to see that our movement in caseload is actually, I think, across Scotland coming down with a slight improvement in the economic climate. So that works both ways, but certainly we do, just to make clear that we do, Scottish local authorities do have that same risk financially. We will pay for the reduction scheme.
Is this on the same issue, or did you want to bring something else in?
About the
I'll come back to it because Linda was wanting to bring on another point. So.
Just on the, what I put my hand up for past, but just on that issue, it's just for clarification for myself. You're talking about this effect locally, Les. So, what was agreed with COSLA, you know, thereby by all the local authorities, is that £17 million collectively would be put in, but it's in kind, isn't it? Yeah. So it's about, so you know, so what you're saying is, like Halls of Broxburn closed, it's a local authority bears it, but it's on their staffing structures and things. So any additional actual money to be paid out would be in terms of having to take on staff or having to cut service elsewhere to cope, rather than saying this is money, hard cash that goes in.
I could just sort of maybe give an example. If if Fife Council, we're paying out for £10 million. If our caseload was to increase and our expenditure was to go up to £11 million, that's reducing our income by £1 million. It would be borne by the council. The council would then have to decide, on top of the contribution that we're already contributing towards the shortfall, which is about £1.2 million, we would still have to fund any increase in the caseload. The same would be true as obviously if our expenditure came down to £9 million. That we would benefit from that, because the Scottish Government element appears to be fixed. So the variable element, yes, we will contribute to making up the shortfall, which COSLA have agreed to and members have agreed to. However, the movement within the overall spend would be borne by individual local authorities on an individual basis.
Okay, thanks.
I'll come over, Peter and then Susan.
Just the key. Come back on your point. It's the key thing is the combination of the local risk, and then the fact that you can and the local design. Because what's happening at the minute now in England is we're still not clear how many, but perhaps you know a significant number of authorities, maybe a quarter, are redesigning their schemes. So it's that sort of fact that there's a kind of ongoing game there. So they take the risk, but then they can set their own rules. Within limits. So it's that allows them to, as it were, move towards the bottom. Not only that you take the risk, which is like, as I understand it in the national, is kind of that's unfortunate, but there's nothing much you can do about that. Whereas in England, you can say, well, we could set our rules to try to offset this in future. That's the dangerous combination, I think.
I think the point that I was going to make was just supporting Les. It's about it's the form in which the funding takes place. It's a fixed term grant settlement, so, and it's based on previous year caseload, so it doesn't reflect caseload growth or movement. And again, there needs to be a mechanism. There's no mechanism just now for in-year adjustment of that, as there was with the former subsidy claim when we were claiming direct from DWP. That needs to be there, and we also need to have a look at how often that fixed term grant is going to be reviewed. So if it was a fixed term grant for 3 years, then that would be an issue. If your caseloads varying. So I think the fixed term nature of the funding exposes local authority to more risk, as well as the funding cut and then potentially the localisation. The other hidden cost is the admin grant cut, which again DWP are cutting the grant year on year, and I know for the next year they're passing part of that grant over to Scottish Government to then distribute to local authorities. But again, it's not reflecting real costs that local authorities are bearing on administering the scheme even as it stands now, far less with any changes. So,
any other expertise from local authorities on this, or any views? Linda, you wanted to raise a point earlier. Did you want to come back to that?
No, that moment passed.
Okay, Ken, I'll come to you then, see if we can move things on to another area.
Yes, well, actually, I was just following up on Mr. Kenway's point about what's happening in England, because I believe that local authorities have introduced a scheme where some previous recipients of council tax benefit would now receive a reduction of, would have to make a contribution of between 8 to 20%, is that right? Can you just explain a little bit more of how that works, how that percentage has been agreed? Is it a tapered scale? What relief, and it only applies across some of the authorities, but just to give us some more background of the options that the English local authorities have pursued.
Certainly. I mean, each local authority has had to design its own scheme. There's, as I say, there's something over 300 of them. About 1 in 5 opted to stick with the present scheme, in some sense just absorb that 10% cut in funding that came through. The others, it's ranged from around 8.5%, which was a government figure that gave them there's an additional transitional grant for a year. I think the opposite extreme, I think there's somewhere asking people to pay 30%. So these, of course, are percentages, if you like, of what we would think of as our ordinary council tax liability. And councils were free to choose. Now, they went through a consultation process. Some of these consultation processes obviously varied, from some ones that were running for several months and were extremely intensive, through to ones that probably did no more than just tick a few boxes. And of course, what that then means is that if, I don't know, you know, we looked at all these schemes, and on average it means that people who previously had to pay no council tax because they were deemed to be too poor to do so, this year we think their average is something under, it's about just under £3 a week, say 140 £140 a year. But that's a varying figure. Some are less than that. There are a very small number of cases where people are being hit by very large, even larger amounts indeed. But it's local discretion and local choice. And in some cases, local authorities have got people who are clearly expert on this subject and have been waiting for this moment to demonstrate their expertise. And others have obviously thought, what on earth are we going to do about this? Let's pick what looks like a standard scheme. So huge variation. There might be some kind of settling down over several years, but the net effect is that people previously had to pay no council tax, now paying on average we reckon about 2.5 million of them, about £3 a week.
So are any of them emerging as good local authority schemes? Are any of them emerging at this stage as good examples to follow, or there's clearly a lot of bad examples?
Too early to say, but I do think that learning process and that information sharing process is an important one. It really was dominated by the fact that around, I think as late as October last year, the UK government announced this transitional grant scheme, which set certain standards, and over half of the authorities went for that. That brought them in, 100 million quid over, 100 authorities is obviously worth going for. So I think it's unclear yet whether there are any obviously good schemes or bad schemes, but they are all, any scheme that is taking money off people who are very, very poor and who are unlikely to be able to pay it. It's very hard to imagine that there will be, in any absolute sense, any good scheme there. Actually, far be it from me to defend the government of Mr Major, But the council tax benefit scheme that was introduced is really a very successful scheme. You know, it restored the credibility of the council tax. It meant, you know, it pushed up collection levels to, you know, levels that are, I think it's right to say, you know, we didn't get rid of council tax benefit because it was broken. That's quite clear. So in some sense, if you want a good scheme, what got introduced 20 years ago was really quite a good one. That stood the test of time.
That I have a number of colleagues that speak to down south, and I knew I was coming here, so I had a few phone calls to make, and there are a number of schemes. I think to understand it, what you have to understand is a 10% cut was made on the overall funding. So, but down south, what they said was that, oh, but what we can't do is we cannot increase the bills for pensioners. So, what you have to do is you have to protect pensioners, and that will be part of the default scheme and any scheme that you introduce. So basically, if you look at your case, our customer base in Scotland, probably over half of them are pensioners. So a 10% then cut to the expenditure, if you're going to introduce a scheme, it's only going to affect working age customers. Therefore, the cut has to be 20%. Now, Peter rightly mentioned that DCLG got a bit nervous with some of the schemes that were coming up. I'll not mention the council's names, but some schemes where they have a high pensioner population in typically welfare neighbourhoods or areas, they were talking about a scheme where I think the largest one we've seen was 40% cut for working age. So people who had paid no council tax before would have to get a bill for 40%. So basically, if you've got a £2,000, work that one out, £800 bill a year. So they came up with, they found £100 million, which then introduced, as you say, about half the schemes now in down south are what called 8% schemes, which basically means a single person pays £90 a year, a couple pay about £120, £130 a year. But it's not across the board. My colleagues in Newcastle, they introduced such a scheme, but their neighbouring authority decided to fully fund the difference for 3 years. So basically now what you've got is the same street, the odd numbers you pay your council tax, the even numbers you don't because the council's decided to fully fund it. And you've got 320 odd schemes. Some of them are similarity, and as you say, there's no emerging good scheme coming out. The only other issue I would sort of raise at this point is that there is a difference within Scotland and we do have down south, and that is that down south, they paid no council tax. They didn't get a bill because the water charges. So basically, these people got zero bills. In Scotland, these people are already getting bills from the council. So in essence, it would actually be easier in Scotland to actually introduce these cuts because we're already billing these people anyway, water charges. I'm saying we're billing, and you do notice I'm not saying we're collecting. The bills go out. The payments from the people who really can't afford it is why. As you say, we've now got collection rates that are probably in Scotland 95% in-year collection rates for council tax, and it's because of the generosity, because we help people, and it goes back to what sort of society you want. You want to help people who can't afford to pay these things. We know for a fact that people who are on benefit don't pay their water charges. It's not because probably they don't want to pay the water charges, it's because they probably can't afford to pay the water charges. But there is a definite comparison, and I would agree the council tax benefit scheme was a good scheme.
I just say, you know, this is on top of the arrears that have been built up with people hit by the bedroom tax. You know, the false economy, TUC false economy report showed that over 50,000 people have fallen into arrears already with that. And, you know, as Les says, in Scotland, we do bill them for their water and sewage, and a lot of our clients are just not paying that. They're falling into arrears. This 8 or 10 or whatever it turns out to be is just going to be added to that, and the onus on the council is back to them collecting, spending more money on chasing people up.
Chasing people up on behalf of Scottish Water and they'll get the money back from Scottish Water for
and
doing it.
The most that they can dock from somebody's benefit is like £3.60 a week. So you can imagine that if somebody's built up a £4,000 debt, which we have many clients that have for just not paying the water and sewerage, that's never going to be, it's never going to be paid off.
But Scottish Water in Scotland's hands, you know, it could be worse if we've got a situation as we see down south where the industry has been privatised.
It'll be in Scotland's hands in collecting their own money. But Peter?
Just to follow up on the points that Sarah and Les have been making, one of the things that's been interesting in some of our work with community organisations, with people who are living on low incomes, is that this issue doesn't come up very often. The issue of council tax reduction scheme doesn't come up very often. So when we're talking to people, the main focus over the last 6 months has undoubtedly been bedroom tax. But I thought what was interesting from some of the things that Sarah and Peter were saying were about these small, sometimes small amounts of money, or seem small amounts of money. And the thing that strikes us from some of the work we've been doing over the last 6 months, over the last year, is the focus on those very small amounts of money. And that's what people talk to us about the struggle to find that extra few pounds a week. So I think that's kind of the importance of the scheme as it appears to be working at the moment, is that it's allowing people to retain some of that money that under other systems they might not be able to.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I guess it's just to back up what Peter was saying, that I'm obviously working for an organisation which is working with perhaps those that are perhaps the most poor, the most marginalised, and subsequently the most vulnerable people who've been homeless and who are formerly homeless. We're noticing through the impact of welfare reform sort of really tangible percentages, really notable percentages. For example, 20% of the people that we work with in Edinburgh are encountering some form of sanction, some form of issues surrounding their payments. The challenge for us is that that obviously has a direct effect on the service user that we're working with. It also has a direct effect on the organisation. We're just a small voluntary organisation, but you know, we might lose housing benefit as well. So that harms our cash flow as well, and we need to be there to support these individuals. And we've been gathering data for a number of months now, and what is really interesting is, as well as the financial impact and the insecurity and uncertainty that brings, we're noticing a real impact on the health, particularly the mental health of these individuals that we're working with. And they're saying to us, the major issue for me is you know, I've got money worries, but actually, you know, my health has been really severely impacted now, and you know, I think that's a, you know, it's a really notable part of you know, like the life of many of our service users are living now, that level of uncertainty, financial peril, if you like.
I was shocked this morning. I saw a report before I came in of a young man who was sanctioned who'd been discovered to have malnutrition. You know, I mean, that's just appalling to be in those circumstances. I'm going to come to Jamie and then to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Convener. Just to take the discussion a slightly different way, if that's okay, and to return, because earlier there was discussion about the budget more generally, and you know, we heard the issues about digging into the figures, which I understand now on the record, but I want to focus on what we do know and what is set out in the budget. We know that there's £33 million for the Scottish Welfare Fund. We know there's £23 million towards the shortfall from 10% cut to council tax benefit monies in the council tax reduction scheme. We know there's £20 million for discretionary housing payments. We know there's £7.6 million to support advice agents. We know there's funding for the delivery of passport benefits. So the question, I think, is an important one to ask, because obviously these are budgetary decisions that have been taken. They didn't have to be taken, but they are decisions that have been taken by the Scottish Government. Do people around the table welcome these decisions?
I think, of course, we welcome that, and I think it's a great recognition by the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament more generally of the intense need that's now coming as a result of not just austerity and recession, but the welfare changes on top of that. And it's a very welcome recognition of the kind of support that a lot of organisations that are trying to deal with some of the problems of their clients in these situations and the kind of demands that are being put on them. So yes, definitely welcome. But I think we also need to recognise that a lot of these provisions are short-term and temporary at the moment. They're not provisions which have got a sustainability built into them over the future. Most of these provisions are 1 year or 2 year provisions, and at the end of the day, I think we need to realise that at this stage we are just patching up some of the problems, and we do need to very quickly start moving in a direction where we start thinking about what kind of solution we want to see, because this is certainly not a sustainable situation we're in. And I think the thinking about the kind of solutions that we need in terms of reducing the demand, whether it's how we tackle the economy, job outcomes, or community support, that kind of thinking has to happen now. I don't think we have the luxury of waiting until after the referendum or a few years' time. We have to make those decisions, look into the solutions now. And I think we can learn from what's happening across in other parts of the UK. We had examples of, we had Mr. McIntosh's point made about what can we learn from some of the different ways in which some of our local authorities in south of the border might be taking, and I realise there are some difficulties there as well. But I think we do need to start that discussion now, and that discussion needs to be a full and open discussion with wider society and civil society.
I think the important, it is different in Scotland to England and Wales, and we should be kind of proud of that. I mean, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation produced a report to say that 18% of households, people in Scotland in work, are living in poverty. Now, that sounds a lot, but in England it's 22% and in Wales it's 23%, and we want to make sure that we keep that figure down.
Do people welcome the decisions that have been taken in terms of the array of investment that's been made?
To come back to you, Jamie, I think, the Poverty Alliance has broadly welcomed the approach that's been taken around the Scottish Welfare Fund, and I know there'll be a bill forthcoming, and we'll see some of that put in place, which may well address some of Bashir's points about the sustainability and long-term nature of some of these responses. And I think what we've seen is in many ways a necessary response to a situation that is that's bigger than the level of response that we've been able to make. So it's not possible, really, I think, to build a comprehensive response to the kind of changes that are taking place in the welfare system just on advice services. And I think we all know that and we recognise that. But I think in terms of the response that we can make at the moment, then it's been a necessary part of that. Around mitigation of the impact of the bedroom tax, again, we've welcomed that. So I think there's a lot that's being done. I think we need to think, as Bashir has said, about how we move on to a different kind of approach to supporting people in communities that goes beyond just advice services. That's not to diminish the absolute importance of those services in helping people at the moment, but I think at the moment we're almost just responding and dealing with crises after crisis, and at some point we have to move beyond that.
Yes.
There's just one point, about the short-term nature of the funding. I don't think you can do anything else, or the Scottish Government couldn't do anything else. It's just because if you start looking at the welfare reforms that are still to come, that is the major thing, that we're probably only about a fifth of the way through. We've still got 80% of the cuts to come. And this will be things like limiting rises to CPI, the DLA to personal independence payment is going to have a major impact, because that affects not only that benefit, there are no appeal right, well there are appeal rights, but you don't get any benefit whilst you appeal. It's not like the current process, and it has a knock-on impact on housing costs and for council tax support. So all these are still to come. So I don't think we could, or certainly the Scottish Government could do any more. And certainly we, as a local authority, we would welcome things like the DHP and the Welfare Fund, the money that's been put forward for that.
We've heard quite a lot this morning about the complexity of all of this. We've heard from Mr. Drury the impact and the clients that he's dealing with in terms of sanctioning, the huge impacts that there are in some of these changes. And obviously, a huge amount more burdens have been placed on local authority staff, the voluntary sector and the advice agencies. In my day-to-day work, I am seeing impacts on my staff with some of the cases that are coming in to our office. Can I ask folks how they are finding things? Is it much more difficult to ensure that people are okay in their jobs? Is it difficult for the voluntary sector to find folk to volunteer in certain areas at this moment in time because of all of this? Because although many of us who are dealing with this, who are still in work and don't have to rely on benefit, there is, I think, an impact on those folks who are having to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. And I don't think that has been taken account of to the degree that it probably should be. Maybe Miss Flavel will want to go first because I see her nodding there, Convener.
I think actually it's funny that you should say that. We lost 2 volunteers recently. One because somebody was volunteering that was retired and had to go back to work because her husband's hours had been cut, and another one who was working a certain number of hours, a lone parent, and she was volunteering for us in her spare time and had to give it up because she couldn't afford to continue doing it. And we can't afford to pay any more staff. I mean, I'm sure, I don't know whether Paul's organisation is as complicated, but we have so many different batches of funding from Money Advice Scotland for the money advisors, and welfare rights advisors get funded from elsewhere. And at the moment, as I said, we don't even know how much money we're going to be getting from the council in 6 months' time, because they're not, you know, they can't. I'm not blaming the council. It's obviously they have to review their spending, but they're not being able to tell us how much we're going to have in 6 months' time. So we can't guarantee any of our staff can have a job in 6 months' time.
I think this is very important in budgetary terms, Convener, because obviously no volunteers means sometimes more paid staff, or not, as the case may be. It means that the service that organisations are providing goes down. I wonder if Mr. Drury would.
Yeah, I would echo what Sarah said. We're an organisation that hugely relies on our volunteers, and there have been very clear instances where people, particularly those who are in supported volunteering placements, are finding it exceptionally difficult. It's really quite curious as well that staff are able to deal with our service users with a degree of empathy that they might never have experienced before, because quite often they're sharing some of the same challenges, because many of our staff are you know, at the lower end of you know, the pay scales. So I would say that, and thirdly, there is a slight short-termism nature to some of our funding agreements at present, and that brings a slight concern about being able to, as organisations, build a resilience for dealing with the issues in the future, because quite often you're not actually sure whether or not you'll be able to be in a position to help people, you know, in particular areas in the months and years to come.
I wonder if Miss Capel.
On this point, Kevin.
Yeah, just to answer the points. We've been we rely on volunteers, I guess, in a slightly different way. We want people to come forward who are going to tell their story about the impact of some of this, and we're finding that people, it's very difficult for them, but increasingly are willing to do that, although there is a sense of cynicism about as well about what change can be made. But we've also been doing work for quite some time now in West Lothian, supported by West Lothian Council, to look at the impact, to raise awareness about the impact of welfare changes, and to sort of help monitor on an ongoing basis that impact. And we did some work recently with the Housing Association in West Lothian, and it was precisely those points that you made about the impact on staff that again struck our staff out there who were doing the work. People not just talking about an increased workload and busier phone lines and all that kind of stuff, but also this sense in which people are given far more intense emotional support to their clients, and that is an additional source of stress for staff in many organisations, not just this housing association that we're involved in the tracking work that we're doing. One of the clients said, you know, all the welfare reforms are getting in the way of us doing a better job and actually supporting people. So there's a sense in which people are responding to what they have to respond to the problems that are being presented to them, but that's actually getting in the way of dealing with longer term issues and helping people to move on and lead better lives. So, and just finally, that issue about staff experiencing some of the problems themselves with this housing association. People are doing better off calculations for themselves and finding that actually they're not that far away from some of the so-called clients that they're trying to help.
I was going to come to Jackie Coppell because I wanted to go into. I'm mindful of the time, and there's a couple of areas that we haven't touched on yet, and I was thinking that you might be helpful in terms of this specific question. It's the implications of means testing. Obviously, we have the CTR reducing by 20 pence for each extra pound, but given that more people are in part-time work and short-term work, can you give us a flavour of how that impacts on the fluctuations affecting yourselves?
I can obviously only speak from a Dundee perspective and what we're seeing there. Our caseload, like Les's, our CTR caseload has actually come down in the last 12 months. So that's obviously a good news story for us, and we've got less people claiming council tax reduction. But in terms of the taper and those in-work claims, it's difficult to actually say, but we're still finding a difficulty in collecting from those that are in work and asking them to pay more because of their actual level of income. So for us in Dundee, collection is still a big problem. Those that are on a limited income and are affected by the taper, then they've not got that excess income to pay their council tax. So that's where we're finding the difficulty. So they've still got their water and sewage charges to pay, but on top of that, they've got an additional council tax bill to pay as well.
Complexities of rules on non-dependent students and various other things. I can see.
Yeah, it just adds to everything. Individuals out there. It's hard enough for staff. For my staff, they're obviously applying a housing benefit scheme as well as a council tax reduction scheme. Now, at the moment, there's not much difference between the two of them. One just replicates the other. But an individual can't, they can't work it out themselves. They rely on our staff to come in and help them do a calculation for them. If I take a job and this is my potential income, what effect is that going to have on my income? And they are often worse off taking that job at the moment, depending on the hours that they're having to work.
Is that the experience, Les?
I think you have to take the tapers into account, and not wanting to sound too controversial, but I can't understand why reduction of council tax benefit wasn't taken into universal credit. Because the way the tapers work, for every extra pound you have over a set limit, you lose so much in that pound. Now, at the moment, if you're on housing benefit, you lose 65 pence in the pound. Add on to that, if you're on council tax reduction, you lose 20 pence in the pound. Now, universal credit, the taper is going to be around 70%, I believe. So, but still, if somebody takes extra income, they're going to lose 70% of the universal credit, plus they're still going to lose the council tax reduction. I didn't see why, if you're going to have a means-tested benefit, and one means-tested benefit, why you would want to localise council tax reduction. Not the fact that it is a good sense that we actually operate the system, we probably do it more efficiently, but I just think nationally, if you're taking the housing costs into account and universal credit, you should have taken council tax reduction in as well.
Still, according to the latest, but yeah, it's the same. It doesn't change much.
Wait, oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I guess the point I wanted to make here, I think there's a good opportunity to make it, is that one of the factors that we haven't really spoken about, I think is really important, is how a lot of this visibility we're now getting for council tax support alongside some of the other welfare changes, particularly as they're decoupled from the the other benefits, the visibility, what kind of impact that is having on public attitudes. We've seen a very divisive debate around support for people in poverty. And if you look at general public attitudes across the board, many people are not quite in the same manner of thinking as many people around the table here and many of the organisations that are trying to tackle some of these issues. Many people do see their neighbours not paying the water rates and sewerage charges, and they have problems with that, and they build up a lot of resentment and anger towards people around them. And this kind of division, what concerns me is as we make some of these systems, some of these support systems and the welfare support that we've been talking about in terms of the budget more and more visible, what kind of impact is this having on divisions within communities that we're seeing, and how are we going to tackle that?
Dr. Kenway and then Annabelle.
Yes, very. I think that's why it's very important, although that first point in my evidence about this not really being a benefit is in one sense a techie, wordy point. I think there's a substantial point behind it, which is that this isn't a benefit. This is really a tax rebate. And one way I think to help people through these conflicts, which you absolutely correctly describe, is to put it in those terms. Why are we asking people whose income is only £3,500 a year, if they're on JSA, you can do that sum, 3,600. We don't ask people on that income to pay any income tax. Why are we asking them, therefore, to start paying council tax? Now, a former Prime Minister had an answer to that. I don't think that answer was, that everybody should contribute something. But I don't think that answer was shared here particularly well. But I think that's why it is important to say this is not a benefit. This is a rebate. And this is an integral part of the tax system. And the question is, at what level of income should we expect people to start paying? And if you pitch it like that, I think there's some chance, because these conflicts you describe, which in their positive form represent empathy, as somebody said, in their negative form represent, my God, I'm struggling, and people are. So I think that's why it's important to try to put it like that, if that's possible.
Thank you, Kavira. Yes, just going back to the point that Les was making, and also Jackie, about the universal credit that's coming and the lack of any real joined-up approach. I just wonder if we could tease out in a wee bit more detail what potential impacts there will be when we have universal credit, if we have universal credit, depending on what happens in the years to come. But what, in light of the fact that the housing benefit and council tax benefit have been disaggregated, we're getting universal credit, which, as Les says, doesn't factor council tax benefit in. I mean, what concretely for local authorities in specific examples is that going to mean for collection, for impacts on local residents?
I think for collection, it will affect collection, and it will have, as a local authority, we'll have a harder job collecting the council tax. We have found even this year that we've had to chase so many more claimants to apply for council tax reduction, because in previous years it was joined with the housing benefit, and we can use the information from the DWP. Because we can't use that information, we're really having to chase claimants to apply for their council tax reduction. And that is obviously resource intensive on the local authority. We don't want people to lose out on their council tax reduction, so we are making a conscious effort to do that. But again, because they see it as it's always been done for them in previous years, because it's been part of the housing benefit or done alongside the housing benefit. Now that there's a separation, they are finding it more difficult or duplicating the efforts that they're doing with the Job Centre Plus and then with the local authority. So I think that can only get worse under universal credit.
Ask a question.
It was actually that very question. Just it's just about the clearly there's going to be a separation between the two different systems. Now you said earlier, Jackie, that you're running them, your staff run them in parallel, but they're going to separate. One specific would be there's the discretionary payments that were available under the old system for both housing benefit and for council tax reduction. I think, Peter, you were suggesting that there hasn't been a huge amount of emphasis on council tax reduction, but is the lack of discretionary payments for council tax reduction going to be an issue, or is it an issue yet? Or
it could be eventually, yeah. It's probably an unknown answer from my perspective at the moment.
Did you make before? Was it a big?
No, it wasn't many for council tax reduction. The majority of it was obviously housing benefit, and there was a very, very small number in council tax reduction. Obviously, that luxury is not there now at all to make any. But as we see things changing and people falling further into poverty with the changes to welfare reform, then that could be something that would be welcomed, a discretionary fund for council tax reduction.
Susan?
I think if you don't mind, I'll go back to Annabelle's first quite. It's the way we administer housing benefit and council tax reduction together is very efficient. We get the information once and use it twice. Obviously, that's going to be disaggregated. Give you figures that my current caseload for housing benefit is 34,000 and I've got just under 40,000 council tax reduction cases. So obviously we look at it and saying, right, okay, my point is about my workforce planning, the fact that we get funding to administer housing benefit. That funding, when we move to universal credit, is going to be removed. But this is a cost-shunting exercise that we're still going to be left with. I'm still going to be left with 40,000 council tax reduction cases to administer, but primarily with no funding for dealing with the housing benefit element of it. So somebody's going to have to pay for that, whether that'll be the Scottish Government or whether it'll be the local authority, or whether we still have a council tax reduction scheme in the same format. So it's just it is a very efficient way at the moment. And as Jackie says, as we move away, there are data issues that the DWP won't allow us to use some of the data where you've got council tax reduction only, so we're chasing people. And people don't seem to be... council tax isn't like rent. I'm not going to lose my house if I don't pay it. So the attitude is that sometimes they're a bit remiss at filling forms, a bit remiss at returning forms. So the actual administration actually goes up. And we talked about earlier about staffing. We have issues with staffing that obviously they can see the writing on the wall that housing benefits going, so staff retention becomes an issue for local authorities, and especially when they've got things like moving to other areas such as housing or whatever, and customer services like jobs. We do have certain issues with that. On the issue of discretion, we paid about 2 to 5% on council tax. But maybe it's an issue when we start looking at the money we're getting from Scottish Government, the DHP fund, that we might want to look at. Perhaps some of that may be used, or some of the other funding we've got may be used to open up our own discretionary schemes.
Can I ask just, if you could remind us why it is that DWP has refused to share the information?
It's not refused to share it. It's only, I was to say, it's only for a small proportion. Where you've still got a link case, that's fine. It's where you've got council tax reduction only. They're now, because it's not a DWP, a social security benefit, they are not allowed to, they will give us an indication this person's claimed, will then allow us to follow up, but we're not allowed to rely on that information to award council tax reduction.
Okay, but for
the vast majority is fine, yes.
I think there was a few points I wanted to make on disaggregation and then come back to DHP. I think a lot of local authorities, as Les said, because of efficiency savings, moved to a generic service, so housing benefit and council tax reduction, as well as rent and council tax liability arrangements, are all done by the same staff. So one of the main issues for local authorities that they're facing are the cost of disaggregating the generic service. There's also difficulties in establishing the true cost of CTR administration because of the efficiencies, because it's a single claim and a single system. Just now, there's going to be problems absolutely establishing the true cost of CTR admin, and obviously the admin grant from DWP is being cut and transferred over to Scottish Government. The impacts on customers are duplication, increased bureaucracy and lack of transparency. Obviously, that's obvious. It's not efficient if they're going to have to provide information to local authorities and also information to DWP for universal credit. That's an issue for our customers. There are going to be major issues for software suppliers because most authorities have single systems, not a standalone council tax reduction system, and they'll have to disaggregate their programming And that's going to then impact on potentially, will there be an additional cost of a standalone CTR system? So there's lots of issues around costs and lots of real problems for local authorities in disaggregating, as well as the loss of efficiency savings. In relation to DHP, it's a similar story. Prior to 2013, very few cases paid DHP for council tax, but if you're going to introduce localisation, then it's a very important mitigating tool. And I think if you bring in localisation and you pass on funding cuts, especially if there's protection for pensioners, because working age claimants, 42% of them are passported in our area, so they're already at safety net. You would need to introduce, if you're going to introduce cuts, a mitigating tool, which would be a discretionary scheme.
I've got a terrible habit. This phone keeps switching on when it's in my pocket. I don't know why he's doing that. I'll need to find one that doesn't do that. Linda, you wanted to make a
Aye, it was, you know, just to pick up Susan's last point there about localisation. It struck me earlier, in fact, even before the meeting, reading your paper, Peter, I was filled with horror at what's potentially happening with localisation south of the border. And during this discussion, we've heard a couple of times, if localisation were to come in, I would just like a general view around the table, convener, about whether people think localisation is appropriate in terms of the council tax reduction, or whether, in fact, people would like to see a preservation of the way that the Scottish Government has started, along with COSLA, to deal with it.
Well, the question's been asked, Alex, so if any comments to make on it or observations, even if it's to say what you've just said.
Not being made, and I can't think of anyone who's proposing around things like council tax reduction scheme that it's localised, and certainly the Alliance, the Scottish Campaign on Welfare Reform, lobbied and argued quite strongly for the Scottish Welfare Fund to be a national scheme, and I think we would apply the same logic to council tax reduction scheme.
I think the only issue would come round to the funding, if the funding was to be withdrawn, and how do you actually impose a 10% cut? That would be the only issue, and whether you start to look at other things like other reductions that are in council tax lines, like discounts and exemptions. Should it, for example, should single people get a 25% discount just because they're single? Do they not use the same services? So it may be that longer term, but certainly my professional view for the association is no, retain the national scheme for as long as possible and fully fund it.
And I think that something that Jackie said about, currently there's not a huge take-up necessarily of council tax reduction. That is only going to increase when universal credit comes in, because it will be the only benefit that's taken at source. So those people have not got to remember to save that money. It goes straight back to the council. When they're on universal credit, everything else is in their pocket. And I think that we certainly will be encouraging more people to claim council tax reduction, which would put a huge pressure on the councils if it was localised.
I think the only thing I would make on this point would be that, scrutiny is important. And if having a scheme at a national level means there's going to be more scrutiny of the policy, then I think that's valuable. If you can guarantee a similar level of scrutiny at local levels, maybe that's part of the discussion then as well. But I think absolutely critical is the level of scrutiny you can bring to bear on any decisions made on how the scheme is run.
I'm mindful of the time, but I want to give our witnesses one last opportunity. If there's anything that you would like to add to what you've already heard, or some points that you want to re-emphasise in terms of importance for us to take on board and consider more in depth, then now's your opportunity to flag that up to us. Don't think this is your last opportunity. If you go away thinking, oh, I wish I should have said, or I could provide more information, please send it to us. We'll be more than happy to receive written contributions. But Jackie, you wanted to make a
I think
point?
I just wanted to pick up on your point about staffing and the effect of the welfare reform changes on staffing. We have noticed a big impact on our staff that are dealing with the discretionary housing payments and Scottish Welfare Fund, and those that are experienced in housing benefit as well because of the under occupancy charge. They're dealing with people who are finding themselves in severe poverty and situations that they've not found themselves in before, and that is having an adverse effect on our staff because they're dealing with it day in and day out, and they're hearing people's tales of woe, and they can't help them. In terms of the under occupancy charge, people who genuinely need 2 bedrooms, but there's nothing within the legislation that would allow our staff to pay those 2 bedrooms. We ask them to apply for a discretionary housing payment. They do that, but that again is a short-term measure. It's we can't pay a discretionary housing payment forever, and so it is having an effect on staff's mental health and how they're feeling about doing their job day in day out, because they feel that they can't help the people that need that help.
Yeah, just one final thing about the impact of welfare reform. I think my experience has been that we find ourselves actually collecting so much data now and so much information. It delivers an added pressure for organisations such as ourselves, but the information is really telling about like, for example, the amount of people who need to move for bedroom tax reasons but can't because there's lack of accommodation and certainly not necessarily in the rural areas, but in some of our kind of areas where people are being asked to move, not just to a different scheme or something, but actually move towns within a local authority, and losing their social networks, losing their opportunity to have positive social interaction with people round about them who they know. I think that's a challenge, and we need to do everything that we can to mitigate against that.
Sort of emphasise the point that a lot of the people that benefit from council tax reduction are people that are working, low-paid, working people. And under universal credit, 0 hours contracts are only going to become easier for employers with the PAYE live feed. You work 10 hours one week, you don't work the next week. It's not going to encourage employers not to give these 0 hours contracts. And it's a lifeline for people that are low-paid, part-time workers, not just people that are on benefits.
Just 2 things. I think I'm a bit indicated that I would like to see council tax reduction within universal credit. Either that or remove housing costs from universal credit. I just think local authorities are the best place to people to be paying the housing costs. And just on this, about people who claiming benefits, as I say, a large proportion of them are working. When universal credit comes in, I'm looking at my staff, and about 30 to 40% of them might actually be recipients of universal credit.
Thanks very much to everyone for your contributions. As I said, if you've got any other information you want to feed back to us, please feel free to do that. But thanks very much for your contributions today. I'll suspend for a few minutes to let our witnesses move out. Right. The second item of business for us to consider today is a report back on the fact-finding visit to meet DWP decision-makers at the Bathgate Benefit Centre. I attended that visit along with Annabelle Ewing and Alec Johnson, and I'd like to offer Annabelle the opportunity to report back, and then Alec and I will offer any additional comments if that's necessary, but I'll leave it to you,
okay,
Annabelle.
thank you, convener. So yes, we, the three of us attended last week at the DWP office in Bathgate, and we met with the site manager, the group manager, plus three decision makers. And what we did was they felt it appropriate to go through three case studies with obviously names and addresses deleted by way of examples of different elements of how of their caseload and how they go about it. In terms of kind of general points that arose, the decision makers were clearly making decisions within the parameters set by the rules applicable to them, so really by the DWP. They did stress that they were not required to meet any quota in terms of the number of cases allowed or disallowed. We also got to the issue of, in the medical report forms, the issue of points actually being placed by ATOS, further to the medical examination, on different elements of the work capability assessment. We did try to get to the bottom of whether ATOS does award points or not, and the answer we were given is that the medical report form will include points by way of recommendation, but these points are not the end of the story. They're a recommendation, and then the decision makers will look at the whole information before them, being the information from the applicant and the medical report assessment form by the ATOS individual, and where there is evidence from the GP or further medical evidence, they will look at that as well. They were at pains to say that they look at all the information and that the points appearing on the form they receive from ATOS are simply recommendations and not the final decision. They also indicated that further to the Harrington reviews, they have changed some of the procedures in terms of number of callbacks they will make to reach an applicant by phone. When the decision maker needs further information, they say they call back at least 2 times. They also say that the Harrington reviews led to the inclusion within the work capability assessment documentation of a personalised summary of the applicant, of the client. They also provided some information to the effect that actually the procedure now is that within 1 month of the applicant, the client receiving notification of the decision maker's decision, if the applicant provides further information that's relevant and compelling, the decision maker could change their decision absent going through the appeal process. And I think that was actually quite an important piece of information to extract, because that is something we can in turn pass on to our constituents. In terms of the case studies, one concerned a person who was actually receiving treatment for cancer, and that person was put into the support group. That was a kind of clear-cut case, if you like, where certain obvious conditions were met. The second case was more of a grey area, if you like, where the applicant had provided information and the ATOS recommendation was 6 points for mobility, and thus the points reached were not high enough to secure support group status. The decision makers did say that they looked at that case and looked at all the information they had before them, and they decided, in fact, to up the points awarded for mobility. And that was an example of a case where the decision makers changed went against the recommendation from ATOS. And the third case they provided was information whereby the award was not made, the points were not sufficient, and again, I guess that case seemed fairly clear-cut from that perspective. However, there were certain issues that arose, and I'm sure that the convener and Alex Johnson will raise the points they wish to make, but I just wanted to raise a few. The way that the medical report form is set out, I mean, firstly, it does say on the front who who carried out the assessment and what their status is, at least on the 3 case studies we saw. They took the papers back because they felt that that was the best thing to do, notwithstanding they had deleted the salient information about identity, but they wanted to have a belts and braces approach to confidentiality. But it was clear in the front of the form that actually it does state the qualification, if you like, of the person carrying out the assessment. So one of our papers was a doctor, I think, one was a nurse. I don't know if the third one mentioned. And the point about the ATOS recommendation, so on a whole series of categories in this form, ATOS awards 0 points. And I did ask the decision makers whether, in fact, when they say that they look at the whole information again, whether they do have a detailed consideration of all the 0 categories, because if you suddenly got points in one of these many categories, you could find yourself being in a completely different position. They stress that they did do that. My fear would be that the minute you have something on paper, that is the presumption. And to then change that is changing the status quo, and that's a slightly different psychological approach. The other key, well, 2 other points. One, the descriptors, we're back to the descriptors and what relevance they could possibly have for the real world of work. We had a discussion in the second case about the applicant who was able to sit apparently for more than an hour. But what relevance that would have for carrying out an 8-hour shift at work was not clear. And to be fair, that's not really for the decision makers, but we did wish to raise that observation. The other observation I had reading the forms before they were taken back on the medical assessment form, and these headings arise where in your application you say that depression has been an issue in your own personal history. And some of the headings then apparently to do with that will be triggered where depression has been mentioned or a mental health issue has been mentioned in the initial application from the applicant is entitled, quotation, thoughts, close quotations. And then the language is, does not ruminate, and brackets, ruminate is then defined as recurrent or persistent thoughts involving complex sequences and internal debates that enter the mind despite efforts to exclude them, close brackets. And then underneath that, there's quotations, no obsessive ideas, close quotations, brackets, distressing repetitive thoughts, close brackets. And I did wonder to what extent any assessment could be made by, your average ATOS examiner, where there's no medical, mental health specialism. How can you, what does this mean in practice? It doesn't mean a lot to me. I mean, there's a lot of people I can think of who may or may not have obsessive ideas, but, it doesn't stop them proceeding with a whole host of things. In any event, so those were the issues that arose for me in particular, and I have to say the visit, everybody was most helpful. They did seek to answer all our questions. The clear message coming was that they are acting within the parameters set, and that then brings us back to probably some of the broader issues that we've discussed before. One last point, if I may, Convener. At the end of the medical assessment form, there's a declaration to be completed by the person conducting the examination, and I quote, this is what they have to sign, swear to, and they say, I have completed this form in accordance with the current guidance to Block Cato's ESA examining healthcare professionals as issued by the DWP. And then they sign the declaration. Now, my question was, well, can we have, do you have this document, guidance referred to here? And in any event, is it in the public domain? And can we have it? And I have to say, the answers there were not terribly clear. So I suspect we may have to go back to the DWP and try and get hold of that, because that would be very interesting, I think, indeed, to see what guidance it is that they are supposed to comply with when completing the medical assessment forms. Thank you, Convener.
A pretty comprehensive account of the visit. Just a couple of points I wanted to pick up, which not saying they've been missed out, but struck me when I was there because I had no expectation at all about the scale of what we were dealing with. But the centre in Bathgate is different in terms of the scale to the visit we did to the ATOS centre. ATOS have got facilities in different parts of Scotland, whereas the Decision Maker Centre in Bathgate is the only one for Scotland. And not only Scotland, but also the northwest of England. And 2 of the cases that we got were actually from the Lake District. So it surprised me that the scale of what goes on in that facility in Bath. I think last year that there's something like 44,500 cases to review. So I don't know how many staff do that, but certainly the scale of what was happening there struck me as being very significant. What also struck me was, and again, this idea of whether Atos allocate points or recommend points or suggest points, whatever. We were dancing on the head of a pin at one point about what actually they do. But it became quite clear that the decision makers were not actually aware that the further medical information which we have banged on about from the GPs, which has been lacking in so many of the assessments that have taken place, was actually a requirement. That they just thought it was Atos, were they able to get this information, were they not, was it helpful, was it not? They did not know that actually it should be there and was part of the assessment. And I think it was very significant in the case that Annabelle identified. One of the cases, or two of the cases, were fairly clear-cut either way. It was the one in the middle where points had been recommended and then points were added to it when more information became available. And I just think it emphasised to me just how vitally important that additional information from the GPs or health centres is when it comes to making these decisions. Because had the information been available to Atos, or had all of the information been taken into account by Atos, the person may not have had the recommendation not to... It
was noticeable that we were shown some examples or responses from medical professionals which were extremely poor.
Yes, and the level of the information was not particularly good. But again, the point I think that Annabelle has rightly indicated, in that case, the person who carried out the Atos assessment was a nurse. And the descriptors, when it came to getting information in terms of physical activity, movement and what have you, I thought the information was reasonably detailed. But the descriptors when it came to mental health were very, very limited. And the contrast between the assessment in terms of physical ability and mental health, I think, was quite stark. Alex, yeah?
And this is asking for your opinion, or whether you can remember correctly. When we did the visit to Atos some time ago, we were shown, if you like, a worked example of a case which represented a mental health issue. Can you remember if we were told at that time whether individuals with apparent mental health problems were treated any differently, or whether they were seen by people who had any specialist knowledge, or whether it was just a random approach?
It was just random.
I think it's because the form that we saw last week, and I did make the point of asking, because before, once I heard the forms were to be taken back, I did have a quick look at the three of them to check the language, and the language was different in terms of some of the headings once you got to more, mental health type issues. And they said that, in fact, because in those other cases, depression, a mental health issue had not been raised in the initial application form, that was why there was a difference in the headings of those forms. And the one where we had the rumination and the obsessive thoughts and all the rest of it, that was because depression had been raised in the initial application. It's clear that there's not any differentiated approach really to mental health, and that's very, very worrying, and it picks up on the points that were being made in our earlier session about the impact on people, particularly those struggling with mental health issues.
Jamie's got a question, and Kevin, we'll take them in.
Sorry, it's not a question, convener, as such. It's just, thank you to all three of you for the information you provided from what sounds a very interesting visit. It's just to place on record, you recall, over the summer I visited New Horizons Borders, which is the peer support group for folk who've had or have mental health challenges of various types, and that was very much a point they placed on the record when I visited, this concern about A, the types of questions that were being asked, and B, the type of people undertaking the assessment not having the requisite expertise. So it's certainly, from what you have been able to gather and establish from your visit of those undertaking the assessments tallies with the experience of those going through the assessment.
I find myself having to...
I'll just take Kevin first, and then you can make a comment after.
Two things, convener. One of them relates back to questioning that I posed here to the DWP officials, and that is, are any of these decision makers, do they have any medical experience themselves? And my second point is, I'm wondering, you said there were two clear-cut cases, and one where the decision maker chose to move the person up, give them additional points. How many cases are there where the decision makers actually move folk down and take them out of the equation? I think these things are quite important.
The information we were given was that while it is not completely unheard of, it is extremely rare for people to be reclassified downwards.
And the medical aspects of some of the decision makers, the qualifications?
ATOS, all of the staff who conduct ATOS assessments are health professionals of...
I understand that, convener, and I remember that from being there. But in terms of the decision makers, the folk in Bathgate, you know, the DWP were very reticent in saying very much about that. My thinking was that not very many of the decision makers had any medical qualifications, and I just wonder if that was a question that was asked, or if anybody gave any indication.
Decision makers were civil servants. They were experienced in that role and had arrived in that role as a result of the experience they'd gained, but they are civil servants. The medical or the medical knowledge of experience comes on the ATOS side.
Can I just say, going back, just to make it very clear, going back to the pages towards the end of the medical assessment form, where you have, you know, it's more, what's the general appearance of the applicant before them, clothes clean, not, you know, washed, not kempt looking, unkempt looking. So it was kind of observational type questions, but then you got this key thing about thoughts does not ruminate, obsessive ideas. How would you know by looking at somebody whether they're ruminating or not ruminating? And there was no explanation as to what questions had been asked, i.e. it seemed none had been asked to pursue that. And that person got 0 points for that section. And that's my real concern, that that part of the form is just, you know, it's completely meaningless if you're not pursuing those issues. And in any event, how could, with respect, somebody that is not a mental health specialist make any progress with that kind of questioning anyway? Can I just say also for the record, community, that we were accompanied by Rebecca McPhee, our excellent clerk, who prepared the report, so thank you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Any other comments or questions? Alex? Yeah.
Say that I've now attended the visit that took place to ATOS. I have attended the visit to the DWP, and I've also had the experience of hearing or I've sat here and heard about the experiences of individuals who've been through the system. And while there is no part of this process that is foolproof, I doubt very much if it's possible we could ever achieve that. I believe that what I have seen is a system that is broadly robust, that it allows a process where assessments are made and are reviewed and considered, including, as we've heard from the people who came forward as part of the USA meeting, who have gone through the appeals process and had decisions reversed. And I believe that the combination of what we have in front of us is largely robust. And if there are members of the committee who believe that there is some kind of conspiracy afoot to achieve objectives that are not being declared, I have seen no evidence to support that idea.
I think in fairness, I would concur with about 90% of what you've said, Alex. My concern, and we did bring it out at the meeting last week with the DWP decision makers, is that they can be as professional as they want to be, as can the ATOS healthcare professionals. But if what they're looking for bears no relevance to someone's practical experience of work, then it makes no difference how thorough and how professional those individuals are, because if you've done an assessment on the basis that someone can walk 50 metres, can sit for an hour, can lift a box from one position to another, or can raise one of their hands above their head for a period of time, that I could assess 100 people and arrive at the same conclusion on each one of them. But whether that makes someone capable of working an 8-hour shift for 5 days a week, just to me, undermines the whole process. And regardless of how well someone does their job at Atos or someone does their job within that facility in Bathgate, people are going to be taken off of benefits because they're deemed fit for work when clearly that is not the case. And what the assessments from the DWP devised to create that system means that people who need support from society because they're vulnerable are no longer going to get it. And that undermines the whole process and nothing to do with the individuals who are doing the assessments.
To be said, if the system was so robust, why is it that so many folk go to appeal and win an appeal when there is more medical information there? And I think that that is key to all of this.
With respect, I would point out that I included in my assessment the appeals process as being part of that, what makes this system robust. I am well aware that there are more appeals and perhaps more successful appeals than we would like there to have to be, but nevertheless it's a system that seems at the end of that process to produce results that are concurrent with the objectives of the system.
Well, I would disagree with that.
So would I.
And so would I.
Okay, I think there's a consensus around that from some members.
And your agreement was hardly 90%, if I may say so.
I was trying. I was trying my best. Any other points anyone wants to raise on the report? We'll try and pull together some, based on the information that we've collated around the Atos assessments, the DWP visit and various other things. It might be useful to sort of collate all that into some kind of documentation that we can refer to, because I think we have got a lot of information.
And if possible, to perhaps, I think there's at least a couple of questions that obviously presented themselves further to our visit last week that we would like to pursue with the DWP, I think probably, and or UK government directly.
Yeah, we'll look to see what they are and get a letter off to the appropriate people. Okay. We now move into private session for our third item.